Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I have your attention, please? All quiet, please. Thank you. All right, so we're going to do the rest of the World War II unit today, and then you'll be going through your notes and getting ready to do an essay, cumulative assessment, which, as you are looking at this, you will have already seen what the essay is, because I'm going to post that this evening. As I make this, it's this evening. As you watch this, it's the next morning, but whatever. Okay. So anyway, hope you guys are doing well, and looking forward to sharing with you the remainder of the notes on this unit in World War II. And actually, I got some interesting visuals that I came up with. I was going through some old papers. I know some of you guys, as you do notes, you like to do drawings and so forth. And actually, it was interesting when I was in high school, when I was much younger, I was also interested in doing art having to do with history. And so I found these, and I'll share them with you. They're pictures of the presidents of the United States. Yeah, I've got them in my classroom, but you can't look at them. But I've got some images right here that I drew from a book of portraits, official portraits of the president, and we had that. I started when I was 14, and I did like a couple or a few every so often, and I finished when I was like 19. So it does show some progress. I don't know. This was like the first one, John Tyler. Yeah, it's some work, but hey, I got started on it. And actually, by the time I finished this one, this was like the summer right before I turned 19. So yeah, here's John Quincy Adams. So a little bit of progress there. Whoops, let's get it so you can see. Yeah, a little bit better on the shading and so forth. So anyway, I'll pull in some of the pictures that I have for you on that. Let's see, what do we got? Roosevelt and Truman. Yeah, whatever, show and tell. Okay, so let's get right to the notes here. Oh, there we are. So the section we're looking at, the only section that we haven't done yet, is on page 2, and it's right up at the top. It's the effects and results of the war. Now, the interesting thing about this particular section is after World War II. What happens after World War II is going to be very much a big part of what happens at the beginning stages of the Cold War, which is our next unit. So on some of these things, I'm going to talk about them today, and we're going to go into a lot more detail when we get into our next unit. Okay, so to start, we've got these, what do we call it, peace settlements that are taking place. And of course, one of the things that we've already discovered is we have the three main allies here. Obviously, Hitler was at war with Churchill and the British, and then he attacked Stalin and the Soviets, and then, yeah, declared war on the United States. And there's President Roosevelt, not doing too well in his health by that time. The presidents, the leaders of the big three, as it was referred to, they got together and had some face-to-face conversations. There's going to be a number of conferences, two of which are very, very important that you know at this point. One of them is the Yalta Conference. You can write that down. That took place in the Crimea in the Soviet Union. It had been liberated from German occupation. It's pretty much just north of the Black Sea. It's actually on the Black Sea. And that conference took place between February 4th and the 11th of 1945. So by that time, the three big powers, the Allies, had a pretty good sense that the Germans were definitely on the retreat. And so there was a lot of discussion among the big three as to what the world was going to look like, particularly Europe, in the aftermath of World War II. And so what was going to happen? One thing that they discussed and agreed on very quickly was that there was going to be no conditions on the surrender of Germany. In other words, unconditional surrender. Hitler had to surrender. He didn't want to. He got himself killed himself. Yeah. And then there began discussion as far as what was going to be taking place afterwards. How, you know, the details of like, how's the occupation going to go? And of course, the interesting thing is that you had, by 1945, you had Allied forces, the British and the Americans, coming from the west, and you had the Soviet forces coming from the east, and they were all moving toward Germany in rapid succession. And of course, the war would be over that summer. The next big conference that is going to be taking place is the Potsdam Conference. And this is very interesting. This isn't Potsdam, it's in Germany. It's actually just south of Berlin. Used to be a massive residence palatial area for the Prussian, German Kaisers. In any event, what you have here after Germany has surrendered is you have the big three again. There's Churchill, there's Stalin, and of course there's Truman. So what happened to Roosevelt? What happened to Roosevelt? Here's Roosevelt. This is my drawing. Roosevelt. Let me see my drawing. Here's my drawing. You know, cheeky monkeys. There's Roosevelt. I did that drawing based on his official portrait right after I graduated from high school. That was Roosevelt. Okay. Oh, Truman. This is one of the early ones. This is, I was still 14 when I did this one. Truman. Yeah, there's Harry Truman. The buck stops here. Not bad. Okay. So let's get back to the slideshow. Okay. So Potsdam Conference. Some of the key things that they're going to be discussing, of course, is, you know, who's going to occupy what, what's going to happen to Japanese occupied territories in the Pacific and Asia, and, you know, how are things going to get sorted out? And of course, here, this is one thing that you've got going on here is you've got Truman, who was brand new. I mean, he'd been the vice president for not that long. He was the vice presidential running mate for Roosevelt in November 1944 when Roosevelt was elected for the 4th time. Truman had previously been a senator from Missouri, and he wasn't given a lot of the insights and lowdown as far as what was going on in the administration really until after Roosevelt died suddenly in the early part of 1945. So here's Truman with pretty much a full 4-year term, practically four years. And he finds out about certain things like, oh, we're developing nuclear weapons, the Manhattan Project. He'd been pretty much kept in the dark as vice president. And so here he is coming in, working with Churchill and Stalin and trying to figure out exactly what's going to be going on. And of course, it's by this time in the Potsdam Conference, he gets word that the test of the nuclear weapons has been successful, and so he hints at Stalin. Oh yeah, we've got some really big weapon coming along, and And of course, Stalin's like, Stalin knew. He had spies on the inside. We'll talk about that in the next unit. Yeah, there were plenty of Soviet spies as part of the Manhattan Project, and Stalin knew that the nuclear weapons test the United States had, the Trinity test, was successful. So yeah, surprise, surprise. Lots more on that. So it's weird because we've got alliances going on here, but clearly by that point, make sure you put this down. By the time you get to the end of the war, I mean, the British and the United States are like, yeah, we're democracies, we've got similar things. But they kind of sized up, especially Churchill, they sized up Stalin as being, yeah, he's our ally now, but we're going to have to keep an eye on him because he is not helping things out. And the areas of Eastern Europe that were being occupied by Soviet forces, already Stalin was making sure that there was going to be puppet dictatorships, pro-Soviet dictatorships. And he had his army there. The Red Army was there. They were going to make sure that was going to happen. So we'll get into all those details as we go along. Curious thing happened, though, in the midst of the Potsdam Conference, they had an election in Britain. You know, we have our elections every 2 years, our presidential elections every 4 years. You know, we'll never not have an election. We might have to have a mail-in election this fall, but we stick to the calendar. I mean, even during the Civil War, we had an election in 1864, and Abraham Lincoln was opposed by one of his top former generals, and he was reelected. The elections went on schedule. Britain was different. Britain held off having elections until things were cool, after the war had been won in Europe. And curiously enough, In the midst of the time of the Potsdam Conference, the British had an election and decided that their great wartime leader, Winston Churchill, head of the Conservative Party, was not necessarily who they wanted to have leading them going forward. They elected the Labour Party, and the leader of the Labour Party, make sure you get his name, there it is, Clement Attlee, and they were putting forward a program of what they call national health, government provided health coverage, and yeah, so the election went Labour Party's way. Clement Attlee came in as a new prime minister. There he is, all tucked into his chair there. And then partway through the Potsdam Conference, then it's like tag. Churchill goes out and Clement Attlee comes in. And they continue on at the Potsdam Conference. One of the key things that they agreed to at these conferences is that the top German officials and Japanese officials were going to be put on trial for their war crimes. And this is what came out of it. You had the Nuremberg war crimes trials. There is Goering, Hermann Goering, one of the top Nazi leaders, and the other ones basically in the brig put on trial. You had British, Soviet, French, United States judges, you had testimony, and yeah, these guys were put on trial for their war crimes. Same also with the Japanese. Recognize him? Yeah, that's Tojo. Yeah, we talked about, yeah, let me see, were there war crimes that took place? Yeah, rape in Nanking, among other things that took place. And yeah, there were many Japanese that were that paid the penalty of the war crimes that took place. Not all, we know about that. Yeah, you're lucky if you're a member of the royal family. And by the way, that was, even though the Japanese surrendered to the United States, we allowed them to keep their emperor, because the emperor got the word out to everybody on the radio that Japan was going to quit the war. And so Emperor Hirohito got to stick around. Okay. Let's see. Let's also talk about, yes, the occupation of Europe. Okay, take a look at this map right here. The reality was, if you look right here in the eastern portion, the Soviets had occupied that. They had physically removed German troops from all of that area. And a large part of the eastern part of Germany as well. In fact, this sort of gray zone right here was part of Germany. And they're going to redraw the lines. That area right here is going to be carved off and is going to be made part of Poland. East Prussia, part of that is going to be Poland. And you're like, wow, Poland's going to be much bigger. Well, if you recall, at the beginning of World War II, Poland was attacked by Germany and the Soviets, and the Soviets kept this eastern part of Poland. That became part of the Soviet Union. And so Poles, literally millions of Poles were forcibly moved out of eastern Poland. Germans were moved out of western Poland and forced into the East German area of occupation. This is interesting that was going on here, because you had, like, for example, you know, obviously Germany is going to be occupied by the British, the Americans, and the Soviets. And same thing with Austria, which had been, of course, taken over by Germany. And you had those troops all there, the British, the Soviets, and the American troops there. Well, the agreement was, this is very important that you have this, the agreement among the big three was that they would occupy certain areas. They were going to govern the country, like Austria and Germany, all together, cooperating with each other as to how that was going to be. Now, physically, you would have right here in East Germany, this green area, and this part of Austria, that would be the Soviet zone, Soviet troops there. Then you had this kind of pinkish area, that's the British occupied area, sort of northern, western Germany, and then part here in Austria. I had an uncle actually who was in the British military, who was in charge of administering an Austrian town at the conclusion of World War II. It went from fighting the Germans to actually helping to administer them. Fascinating. Then you had the Americans zones here in sort of the southern part of Germany, and then also part of Austria. And then, of course, we, you know, the British and Americans are like, hey, you know, don't forget the French, and the Soviets are like, whatever. If you want to give them something to be in charge of, you can peel it off of your areas. And so, yeah, you're going to have the French zone right here, Austria, and also sort of like right near the French border. And then, very critical, and make sure you write this down. See this little red spot right there? That is the capital city of Berlin. That was occupied initially by Soviet troops. Now, as part of the agreement of the big three, Berlin would be under joint occupation. And if we were to look, and we'll show you another one later on, of a map of Berlin, the eastern portion of Berlin is going to be occupied by Soviet troops, and then the western portion is going to be occupied by British, French, and American troops. And of course, notice that Berlin is contained right within this eastern section, the Soviet section. That was all part of the agreement. And we're going to see there's going to be some areas of tension related to the occupied Germany. And eventually, some of you guys may know this already, we'll get to it in our next unit, we're going to see Germany split in two. These portions right here, occupied by the British, French, and the United States, will become West Germany. The areas occupied by the Soviets are going to be known as East Germany. The area of Berlin, well, that's going to be a little dicey. The western part of Berlin is actually going to be connected to the Western German government. And yeah, Austria is going to have a simpler fate. Austria will end up having all of the Allied troops, including Soviet troops, removed on a promise that Austria is neutral, not on either side. What do you mean sides? Is there going to be sides after World War II? I mean, can't we all get along? We fought the Nazis. Yeah, there's going to be sides during the Cold War, and Austria is going to be neutral. They're not going to be on the Allied side, the American side, nor are they going to be on the Soviet side. Okay. There was also agreements that we'll look at more in detail about like the division of Korea, which Japan had occupied. The northern section is going to be occupied by the Soviets, and the southern section is going to be occupied by the Americans. And yeah, we're going to end up having two countries, and we still have two separate countries, North and South Korea. So this is all part of the agreement that is taking place among the Americans and the British and so forth, and the Soviets. One of the things that they're going to give a go at is creating a United Nations. They start in San Francisco. Ultimately, you'll have your main headquarters of the United Nations in New York City. But here in 1945, the United Nations is put together, and you'll have members from all over the world, all the various different countries. And of course, that membership is going to just become much, much, much bigger as you go into the 1950s and 60s, as all of the territories that had been part of the empires of Britain and France and others end up becoming independent countries. Key details though, right? The idea is collective security, and they want the United Nations to be stronger than the League of Nations, which of course was created after World War I and was pathetic, couldn't do anything. But a curious thing that they put into place here. The Big Five wanted to make sure that the United Nations couldn't be used against their wishes. So there were 5 countries that had veto authority over key decisions made by the United Nations. And these are the 5 winners in World War II. Britain, United States, Soviet Union, France gets a veto, and China. At this time, China was controlled by the nationalist Chiang Kai-shek. Later, when the communists come into power, it's going to be another communist vote. So keep an eye on that. United Nations, we'll be talking about that, United Nations, as we go through the Cold War unit. Okay? Let's see. NATO versus Warsaw Pact. Oh yeah, this is a little bit of an inkling of what's going to be happening as we go into the Cold War. We'll get into all the details of how the Cold War gets started, but just to give you a sense, at least as far as Europe is concerned, you're going to have over here ultimately a contention between the Soviet and its allies. We got that? Allies, yeah. Basically occupied areas. And then the free countries, relatively free, even though Spain is not officially a part of NATO until later on when Franco dies. And even Ireland eventually will join up in there. But basically, you're going to have, I mean, countries are going to look around and they're like, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands. Yeah, they're not counting on neutrality in the future. They definitely want to be part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is going to be what the United States, Canada, and these Western European countries, including Greece and Turkey, are going to be part of. Then you have the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies, basically Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, areas that they have Soviet troops in, and they are forced to be part of this Warsaw Pact. Some of the countries remain neutral. Finland, yeah, they got the Soviets breathing right down them, and they're going to like say, oh yeah, we'll stay neutral. Sweden maintains its neutrality from World War II. Same thing with Switzerland. And Austria is forced to be neutral, as we mentioned to you before, in order to get the Allied troops, including the Soviet troops, out of there. Yugoslavia, they're neutral. Got a communist leader, but remember, those communists overthrew the German occupiers, and not the Soviet troops. It was the Tito and his folks that gained control of that. So even though it's communist, it's not part of the Warsaw Pact. And then Albania kind of goes here, there, and sometimes they're part of the Warsaw Pact, and sometimes they're not. That's why they're portrayed that way. So we'll keep an eye on what's going on there. Make note also, in the other parts of the world, we'll be seeing countries like Japan and the southern part of Korea will become key allies of the United States. And of course, we're going to be looking at issues as far as, well, what's going to happen to the empires, the Dutch and the French and the British empires? Are they going to be able to be maintained? Well, the United States and certainly the Soviets are like, yeah, you shouldn't really be continuing your empire. So there's going to be some tension there. We'll be looking at that quite a bit in detail as we see the ultimate dissolution of the British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire, all these different empires, and some of the challenges that come as a result of that. Okay. Let's see, talked about that. Yeah, some of these we're going to be coming back to when we go into the beginning part of the Cold War unit, which is next. Okay. Yeah, let's talk about this. Oh, yeah, let me throw this term into you because I think I mentioned this as well. Here. Iron Curtain, did we talk about Iron Curtain? Ah, yes, Iron Curtain. That was a phrase that Winston Churchill came up. After he was former prime minister, he was looking at what was going on over here in the Soviet occupied areas. Stalin had said, oh yeah, those people, they could set up their own governments. And Churchill warned the United States and said, hey, there has been an iron curtain that has descended upon the boundaries of these great countries, and behind that iron curtain, freedom no longer exists. The Soviets are mistreating the people, yada, yada, yada. And we, the West, need to stand up against it. It was almost like in the 1930s when he was warning people about Hitler. He was right about that. And he is going to be the one, through his speech about the Iron Curtain, that is going to rally the Americans and others to form what will be known as NATO and to put up resistance. And you can argue early stages of the Cold War. So the Iron Curtain is there. Another key thing that we want to look at, we make sure we've got all those different terms mentioned there. Political ramifications, Iron Curtain. Oh yeah, we got the division of Germany. We'll talk about that. I'll begin with the third bullet point here. Political ramifications and territorial changes. We talked about Austria. Israel. You can't even see Israel down there. Israel is going to, and we mentioned that actually in the last one, Israel from territory that had been British occupied in the Middle East, the area of Palestine, it's going to be able to be created. We'll get into the details of some of the difficulties that will come about as a result of the creation of Israel. Okay. Let's look at the last bullet point, post-war economic problems. Okay. Right. When you go through a very difficult time, like we're going through a difficult time right now, lots of people unemployed, all kinds of economic stresses. At least we're not having bombs, but needless to say, write this down. Europe, and in some places in Europe in particular, were devastated by the war. And they've got all kinds of economic challenges going on. And the United States, it's very interesting because in the Soviet occupied areas, we'll see this later on, Soviet occupied areas, the Soviets are like, yeah, we're going to make you pay for all the damage you did to the Soviet Union, all the damaged factories and so forth. And so they're going to actually be removing equipment from these areas in Eastern Europe. The United States, you know, we got our new allies here, and you know, France and Italy and Britain. I mean, Britain, good grief, they win the war, they're going to be on rations for months and months and months thereafter. Are you kidding? Even though the war was over, they're still having economic hardship. I mean, you had people starving in Germany and other places, and that's not a good condition for you know, this new democracy to be taking root in, you know, formerly fascist Italy and formerly fascist Germany, and even, you know, places like France that had democracy, but also very prone to having unrest. So it was very interesting. Folks in the United States of America, including George C. Marshall, who had gone from being the top military commander to becoming the Secretary of State under President Truman, he helped craft what is known as the Marshall Plan. Here we got a stamp dedicated to him. And excuse me, the Marshall Plan is also known as the European Recovery Program. And this is instituted in the late 1940s, specifically 1948. The idea is to give economic assistance to European countries to help them get out of the difficulty that they've been in. Yes, and also it helped the United States too. You know, sometimes we just give them money, sometimes we loan them money, sometimes we provide them equipment and all kinds of things that they needed. This helped U.S. businesses. It also helped to stabilize the political economic situation in countries, you know, like Italy and France that, you know, you had communists running around there going, hey, we should go communist and so forth. And folks in the United States and Britain are going, I don't think that's a good idea. Let's see if we can put some money on it. Does it make sense to spend a lot of money to keep things from going really, really crazy? Yeah, ask Congress and the president today. That's the part of the mindset behind those big, huge, massive bills that were passed and all the checks that are going out to help unemployed people and so forth during this pandemic. In any event, right after World War II, the Marshall Plan goes into effect. $15 billion spent by the United States of America to help European countries with their difficulties. And that's, let me see, I had that written down, in 2018 dollars, that's $148 billion that goes to those countries. Now, as we'll see, Eastern European countries are invited to participate as well, but the Soviets are like, no, you're not going to take any of that American money. Not going to happen. It doesn't make its way to Yugoslavia and also to many countries in Western Europe. You can see here on this map all the money beneficiaries of the Marshall Plan. Obviously none in Eastern Europe. Spain, yeah, Franco, he doesn't want anything to do with it. But it does help stabilize the situation. It's going to be very important. We'll talk more about the Marshall Plan as we go forward into our next unit. Let's see. Yeah, so, oh, by the way, let me see. Comic-Con? Yeah, Comic-Con. Yeah, it's not a gathering in San Diego for the latest films and Marvel superheroes. Comic-Con, just a real quick thing on Comic-Con, acronym for Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. That's set up by the Soviets. That's their plan for economic improvement and so forth. Hey, guess what you guys got to have? Instead of capitalism in Eastern Europe, you got to have a Soviet-run system whereby the governments that they're going to prop up and establish puppet communist governments in Eastern Europe, yeah, they're going to, you know, do things the way of Karl Marx and so forth. So Comic-Con is the Soviet response to the Marshall Plan. And that's why they tell Eastern European countries, forget about it. You're not going to participate in that American thing. Ain't going to happen. Okay. So I think that pretty much covers it. Now I want you guys always, if you have questions, you know, I'm sure some of you guys, oh, Mr. Hansen talks too fast. I can pause it and replay it and look this up and look that up and so forth. Just know this. Communicate with me. If you have any questions, send me emails and so forth. I want you guys to have a real good sense of what's going on here. And yeah, one more thing I have, let's see. Who do I want to share now? Oh yeah, this guy. Here he is. Because nothing says distance learning than having somebody on camera who has a lot of experience in entertaining and providing good information. So we're going to wrap up this notes with our friend from Crash Course to talk about World War II. Ready? Here we go, and that'll be it.
Finally, a war with some color film. So here at Crash Course, we try to make history reasonably entertaining, and fortunately, World War II was hilarious, said no one ever. Mr. Green, is this like going to be one of the unfunny ones where you build to the big melodramatic conclusion about how I have to imagine the world more complexly? Me from the past, as long as you have that 8th-rate suit strainer, I'm not even going to acknowledge your existence. Right, so you probably heard a lot about World War II from movies and books, the History Channel before it decided that swamp people were history, the incessant droning of your grandparents, etc. We're not going to try to give you a detailed synopsis of the war today. Instead, we're going to try to give a bit of perspective on how the most destructive war in human history happened and why it still matters globally. So one of the reasons history classes tend to be really into wars is that they're easy to put on tests. They start on one day and they end on another day, and they're caused by social, political, and economic conditions that can be examined in a multiple choice kind of manner, except not really. Like, when did World War II start? In September 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland? I'd say no. It actually started when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, or at the very latest, when the Japanese invaded China in 1937, because they didn't stop fighting until 1945. Then again, you could also argue 1933 when Hitler took power, or 1941 when America started fighting. It's complicated. But anyway, in China, the fighting was very brutal, as exemplified by the infamous rape of Nanking, which featured the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Chinese people, and is still so controversial today that, one, it affects relations between Japan and China, and two, even though I have not described it in detail, you can rest assured that there will be angry comments about my use of the word slaughter. But the World War II we know the most about from movies and TV is primarily the war in the European theater, the one that Adolf Hitler started. Hitler is the rare individual who really did make history. Specifically, he made it worse. And if he hadn't existed, it's very unlikely that World War II would have ever happened. But he did exist. And after coming to power in 1933 with the standard revolutionary promises to return the homeland to its former glory, infused with quite a bit of paranoia and anti-Semitism, Germany saw rapid remilitarization and eventually, inevitably, war. In the beginning, it was characterized by a new style of combat made possible by the mechanized technology of tanks, airplanes, and especially trucks. This was the Blitzkrieg, a devastating tactic combining quick movement of troops, tanks, and massive use of air power to support infantry movements. And in the very early years of the war, it was extremely effective. The Nazis were able to roll over Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and then all of France, all within about 9 months between the fall of 1939 and the summer of 1940. So after knocking out most of Central Europe, the Nazis set their sights on Great Britain, but they didn't invade the island, choosing instead to attack it with massive airstrikes. I mean, you look at this poster and think, man, the Queen wants me to finish my term paper, so I can do it. But when this poster was first produced in 1939, it was to quell terror in the face of bombardment. The Battle of Britain was a duel between the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe, and while the RAF denied the Nazis total control of British airspace, the Nazis were still able to bomb Great Britain over and over again in what's known as the Blitz. Stan, no jokes this time. Yes, the Blitz. Meanwhile, Europeans were also fighting each other in North Africa. The Desert Campaign started in 1940 and lasted through 1942. This is where British General Monty Montgomery outfoxed Irwin the Desert Fox Rommel. It's also the place where Americans first fought Nazis in large numbers, but most importantly, it's where Indiana Jones discovered the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, let's go to the thought bubble. 1941 was a big year for World War II. First, the Nazis invaded Russia, breaking a non-aggression pact that the two powers had signed in 1939. This hugely escalated the war and also made allies of the most powerful capitalist countries and the most powerful communist one, an alliance that would stand the test of time and never end until like 3 seconds after the defeat of the Nazis. The Nazi invasion of Russia opened the war up on the so-called Eastern Front, although if you were Russian, it was the Western Front, and it led to millions of deaths, mostly Russian. Also, 1941 saw a day that would live in infamy when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, hoping that such an audacious attack would frighten the United States into staying neutral, which was a pretty stupid gamble because, one, the U.S. was already giving massive aid to the Allies and was hardly saw Japan invading much of Southeast Asia, which made Australia and New Zealand understandably nervous. As part of the British Commonwealth, they were already involved in the war, but now they could fight the Japanese closer to home. And shut up about how I never talk about you Australians. I just gave you 1.5 sentences. But by the time the Americans and Australians started fighting the Japanese, it was already a world war. Sometimes this meant fighting or starving or being bombed. Other times it meant production for the war. You don't think of Argentina as being a World War II powerhouse, for instance, but they were vital to the Allies, supplying 40% of British meat during World War II. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So not to sound jingoistic, but the entry of the U.S. into the war really did change everything, although I doubt the Nazis could have taken Russia regardless. No one conquers Russia in the wintertime, unless you are, wait for it, the Mongols. Okay, we're going to skip most of the big battles of 1942, like the Battle of Midway, which effectively ended Japan's chance of winning the war, and focus on the Battle of Stalingrad. The German attack on Stalingrad, now known as Volgograd because Stalin sucks, was one of the bloodiest battles in the history of war, with more than 2 million dead. The Germans began by dropping more than 1,000 tons of bombs on Stalingrad, and then the Russians responded by hugging the Germans, staying as close to their front lines as possible so that German air support would kill Germans and Russians alike. This kind of worked, although the Germans still took most of the city, but then a Soviet counterattack left the 6th Army of the Nazis completely cut off. And after that, due partly to Hitler's overreaching megalomania and partly to lots of people being scared of him, the 6th Army slowly froze and starved to death before finally surrendering. And of the 91,000 Axis POWs from Stalingrad, only about 6,000 ever returned home. Stalingrad turned the war in Europe, and by 1944, the American strategy of island hopping in the Pacific was taking GIs closer and closer to Japan. Rome was liberated in June by Americans and Canadians, and the successful British, Canadian, and American D-Day invasion of Normandy was the beginning of the end for the Nazis. Oh, it's time for the open letter? An open letter to Canada. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, it's Canadian mittens. I want to thank the Canadian Crash Course fans who sent us these mittens. Canadians are just so nice, Dan. Like, all we ever do on this show is make fun of them, and they're just like, it's so kind of you to mention us. Here's some mittens. Dear Canada, we're not always nice to you here on Crash Course, but you are awesome. I'm pointing, but you can't tell because I'm wearing mittens. 45,000 Canadians died fighting for the Allies in World War II, which means that per capita, Canada lost more people than the United States. You fought with the Royal Air Force to defend Great Britain from the beginning of the war, and you were there on D-Day successfully invading Juno Beach, and as many of you have pointed out in comments, you defeated the United States in the War of 1812, meaning that arguably, Canada, you are the greater military power. Plus, you have lumberjacks and excellent beer and hockey and universal health care and Justin Bieber. I'm jealous.
Really?
That's what it is.
Really?
I'm jealous. Best
Justin.
wishes, John Green. So by the end of 1944, the Allies were advancing from the west, and the Russian Red Army was advancing from the east, and then the last-ditch German offensive at the Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944 and 1945 failed. Mussolini was executed in April of 1945. Hitler committed suicide at the end of that month, and on May 8, 1945, the Allies declared victory in Europe after Germany surrendered unconditionally. 3 months later, the United States dropped the only 2 nuclear weapons ever deployed in war. Japan surrendered, and World War II was over. The war had a definite cause: unbridled military expansion by Germany, Japan, and to a small extent Italy. Now, it's easy to claim that Hitler was crazy or evil, and in fact he was certainly both, but that doesn't explain the Nazis' decision to invade Russia, and it sure doesn't explain Japan's decision to bomb Pearl Harbor. And there are many possible explanations beyond mere evil, but the most interesting one to me involves food. Hitler had a number of reasons for wanting to expand Germany's territory, but he often talked about Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. German agriculture was really inefficiently organized into lots of small farms, and that meant that Germany needed a lot of land in order to be self-sufficient in food production. The plan was to take Poland, the Ukraine, and Eastern Russia, and then resettle that land with lots of Germans so that it could feed German people. This was called the Hunger Plan, because the plan called for 20 million people to starve to death. Many would be the Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians who previously lived on the land. The rest would be Europe's Jews, who would be worked to death. 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis, many by starvation, but many through a chillingly planned effort of extermination in death camps. These death camps can be distinguished from concentration camps or labor camps in that their primary purpose was extermination of Jews, Roma people, communists, homosexuals, disabled people, and others that the Nazis deemed unfit. Some historians believe that the Nazis opened the death camps because the Jews weren't dying as fast as the hunger plan had intended. This was a sickening plan, but it made a kind of demented sense. Rather than becoming more involved in global trade as the British had, the Germans would feed themselves by taking land and killing the people who previously lived there. Similarly, Japan at the beginning of the war was suffering from an acute fear of food shortage because its agricultural sector was having trouble keeping up with population growth. And the Japanese too sought to expand their agricultural holdings by, for instance, resettling farmers in Korea. So while it's tempting to say that World War II was about the Allies fighting for democratic ideals against the totalitarian militaristic imperialism of the fascist Axis powers, it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. For instance, a hugely important Allied power, Stalin's Soviet Union, was like the least democratic place ever. Dan just said that was hyperbole, but it's not. Stalin's Soviet Union is tied with all of the other completely undemocratic countries for last place on the democracy scale. It's a big community there at last place, but they're definitely in there somewhere. And by far the biggest imperialists of the war were the British. They couldn't have fed or clothed themselves or resisted the Nazis without their colonies and commonwealth. So why is World War II so important? Well, first, it proved the old Roman adage, homo homini lupus. Man is a wolf to man. This is seen most clearly in the Holocaust, but all the statistics are staggering. More than 1 million Indian British subjects died, mainly due to famine that could have been avoided if the British had redistributed food, and their failure to do so helped convince Indians that the so-called superior civilization of the British was a sham. More than 1 million Vietnamese died, mainly due to famine. 418,000 Americans. More than 1 million non-combatants in both Germany and Japan, and 20 million people in the Soviet Union, most of them civilians. These civilians were targeted because they helped sustain the war, mostly through industrial and agricultural production. In a total war, when a nation is at war, not just its army, there's no such thing as a non-military target. From the firebombing of Dresden to Tokyo to Hiroshima, the line between soldier and civilian blurred. And then, of course, there is the Holocaust, which horrifies us because the elements of Western progress, record-keeping, industrial production, technology, were used to slaughter millions. World War II saw modern industrial nations, which represented the best of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, descend into once unimaginable cruelty. And what makes World War II such a historical watershed is that in its wake, all of us, in the West or otherwise, were forced to question whether Western dominance of this planet could or should be considered progress. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan.
All right, thank you very much, John Green. Awesome. I appreciate you sharing all your insights and all your summary and everything. Yeah, so we've got it right there. I think he's got some pretty cool, fun things and so forth. Do you guys think I should like add like, you know, props and things like that? This was, I pulled this off of my shelf. It was a gift from my daughter. She gave it to me for a birthday present. It's from a movie called Back to the Future. Do you know who this is? It's Your Density. This is the son of It's Your Density. This is Marty McFly. Recognize that? Okay. All right. Is it time to go? Marty goes. It's time to go. All right. See you guys later. Be safe. Be healthy.